Hello and welcome to ETCIO LeaderSpeak. I'm Sneha Jha, editor of ETCIO, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Rajesh Thapar, Chief Information Security Officer of National Stock Exchange, on this episode of ETCIO LeaderSpeak. Good evening, sir. Welcome to ETCIO LeaderSpeak. Thank you for taking out the time to be with us on this show. The topic for today's conversation is supply chain attacks in the BFSI sector. Now, due to the complexity and the inherent reliance on partners, supply chains are rife with cybersecurity risks and challenges. In fact, it won't be wrong to say that supply chains are a potential playground for hackers. Supply chain attacks are some of the hardest types of threats to prevent because they take advantage of trust relationships between vendors and customers and machine to machine communication channels, such as software update mechanisms that are inherently trusted by users. In this interaction, we will unpack the different types of supply chain attacks in the BFSI sector and the broad spectrum of their impact. We will also talk about the need to emphasize on robust security measures continuously throughout the software development and distribution processes. Good evening, sir. Thank you for joining us on ETCIO LeaderSpeak. Sir, in its digital threat report for the BFSI sector, Certain has highlighted that supply chain attacks are a big risk for the sector due to the sensitive nature of PII data and also because this sector operates in a tightly regulated ecosystem. Financial institutions also rely on third-party companies for vital services such as regulatory compliance, cloud computing, and payment processing. So, what are the kind of vulnerabilities that these partnerships introduce?
See, this supply chain is, or engaging vendors is an integral part of today's any business processing, and it's inevitable part of. So primarily you will need right sourcing, you will need product, you will need innovation, which these partnerships, these vendors bring in. As highlighted in the report that got published by CISA and Certain together on the digital threat report, as you referred. Uh, the key things that which are actually becoming more important with this is the data centric security. I mean, the exposure that these introduces, what sort of data would be visible to somebody who is not required to have a look at it. So some sensitive data may get exposed. You may be potentially impacted by breaches or which are beyond your control. So the vulnerabilities, according to me, are typically around the data breaches. It may be also around regulatory non-compliances, which some of these partnerships may introduce. While at the organization level, most of the regulated entities have adequate set of controls. But when you have these partner integrations or when you have these services available from the partner, there can be instances where non-compliance at the partner's end or the third party ends can lead to a regulatory non-compliance and the impact thereof. So it's an important area to address. The third thing which comes to my mind is primarily around these integrations. How do they work in a I should say in a business continuity environment perspective? How do you make it operationally resilient while your internal charts, BCP scenarios, DR plans are all equipped for challenges happening within the organization? But how do you match it out when third party is involved? So that leg of vulnerability or that leg of risk exposure actually starts creeping in when you have these exposure to the third parties. And the last one, which may not be one entity specific, it may impact multiple entities, wherein a key vendor or a key partner which actually provides services to multiple clients or multiple organizations in one sector or multiple sector, if that entity gets compromised, the impact is much larger because then it impacts multiple entities. It may be critical infrastructure, it may be any other organization set. So the repercussion of that can be felt at probably sometime at a national level as well. If some of the critical these concentrated risk or these vendors get impacted, which are supporting maybe through software, through services, in whatever form. So largely, these are the key exposures that I can think of in case of a third party. partnerships.
So, what are the types of supply chain attacks in the BFSI ecosystem and how do they work?
In today's digital world, the traditional supply chain, which used to be around operations, which would be around people or a set of services, is now becoming more software centric. I mean, so the types of the supply chain attacks that I can think of is uh, is emanating from some of the experiences that we have had in the recent past. We, in the sense, the global industry at large has had in the recent past, is around malware injection in software or hardware. I mean, these are not only software supply chain; it can be hardware supply chain, wherein you have devices, you have appliances, you are procuring machines, and the firmware, hardware of that itself has some embedded malware, which primarily, so malware injection in a hardware or a software is a kind of a supply chain attack. The other kind of supply chain attack can be mismanaged secrets or identities, which probably are getting compromised or have been used, or your secrets which are getting revealed. That's something which is again a supply chain attack, which has actually been materialized. MITM is another variant. It can be a variant. It may not be always in a supply chain, but man in the middle attacks are quite possible in a vendor scenario, in a partner scenario, wherein somebody is intercepting your traffic without you being aware, because the visibility sometimes gets much limited in case of in a supply chain, or in case you're outsourcing events, which is one of the risks that we typically have to address. The other kind of supply chain attack, which is quite rampant and happening quite often, is compromising the code repositories, or through open source components. There is a code set that is entering into organizations and leading to backdoors, or leading to some of those key vulnerabilities which tomorrow can get exploited. There are more of it, something like a traditional target breach, wherein the attacks happen through connected devices. I mean, it can be your HVAC, it can be any other device, or you have extended a VPN and somebody just enters it from there. There you are indirectly exposing out your environment, and you believing your environment is all controlled, but this trust path that you opened up to one of your partners can actually expose you and give you a visibility of an, or not a visibility, but can you give you an attack vector to enter. Last one, or maybe penultimate one that comes to my mind, is around a kind of DDoS. So if one of your vendors or supply chain partners has a DDoS wherein the services are rendered at 24 by 7, immediately the downstream systems get impacted, and it can lead to impact to the BFSI or any other sector providing services to its clients. The last one, a little variant one, which I believe can also start fitting into supply chain, and that to be a little bit of a targeted supply chain, is a watering hole attack, wherein somebody tracks and figures out which websites or which partners do a particular organization employees normally access, and they try to compromise that particular website and try to infuse some content which is malicious, so that when the employees or the users of that entity or organization access it, a malware enters. So that's something which technically are the type of various varied type of supply chain attacks that are today happening or may happen in near future. And how it works is still a traditional supply chain mechanism. It's the same what the kill chain was. It's not very different. Wherein now the attacker or the perpetrator very well understands that most of these regulated entities are pretty strong. Their controls would be largely in place, so it would be difficult for him to penetrate and get in. So what he does is he primarily tries to reach out to the vendors which may be acting as the weakest link in this chain, and they see that, oh, this particular entity takes a product or a vendor or these services from a particular, or a software from a particular vendor, and the compromise is much easier in that chain or in that vendor system, which becomes an entry point of compromise to the eventual organization. So it's a secondary victim, but the primary is impacted. So how it actually works out is gaining access to these third party systems through the typical traditional social engineering mechanisms, or phishing mails, or maybe exploiting some of the vulnerabilities in that environment, or hacking the infrastructure. Once you have done that, then it leverages the breach data. So once it enters, he's also profiling out what sort of credential set has been compromised, what has been available. So it takes up all that, and using it, now it finds an inroad or a path to enter into the organization, which may be through a backdoor, maybe through a credential harvesting, maybe trying to know the lateral movement, getting the visibility of the network profile, whatever it is. So traditional mechanisms of a kill chain are here. Once he has that, he delivers the payload and does the exploitation, which may end up with typically data exfiltration is one of the key ones, or it can lead to a ransomware attack where it is it maybe the eventual responsibility would be on the organization to now protect itself while the entry is coming from a supply chain. The impact is on the end organization, or it takes control of it and eventually leads to more attacks in the due course. So these are few of the ways these attacks work. It's important to break this kill chain. As early we break the kill chain, the better it will be for us.
Absolutely. So that's a perfect segue into my next question. Now, supply chain attacks are dangerous because they are very difficult to detect. The organizations may not even be aware that their vendors have been compromised, or they may not even have a clear visibility of the third party components in their software. So, what are the immediate actions to take after a supply chain attack? And is it a boardroom issue, or is it still a compliance checklist item?
Oh, once a supply chain attack happens, first is it's sometimes difficult to proactively detect it. So you should have mechanism in place. You should have your contracting done at least. If you are not able to direct, because the supply chain attack, you may not be the only victim or the first victim. You may be knowing it after it has happened on another organization, because supply chain attack sometimes is not very centric to one client, because this supply chain window, if you see the example of SolarWinds or Log4j or any of that, it spreads across. It's primarily multiple organizations which automatically become victim. So you should be aware of when, if there is something like that coming your way. First, have you been able to detect it proactively, or somebody is reporting it to you? Do we have it in our contract? I mean, it may not be always equivalent to a SolarWinds or a Log4j. There have been other in the banking sector as well, which have been supply chain attacks. In case of SolarWinds and Log4j, now the attack happened somewhere else, and it just you came to know, or the entity comes to know through the threat intel or any other sources. It's not that you have been impacted. The client may not be impacted, so it's very difficult for it to take actions till the time he doesn't have visibility of it. So first thing is, how do you come to know? Have you got enough intel? Have you got it contracted that the suppliers are informing you if there are any supply chain attacks? So moment you come to know of anything like that, your responsibility is, first thing, validate with the supplier. If you have not come to know directly from the supplier, if it's impacting directly you have entire visibility, you can directly go to and inform regulator, certain, and NCIPC. But if it is you have not been informed, it's a closed user group in entities which have got impacted, you first have to inform the certain and NCIPC and including the regulator, because these entities would be on your side to take further actions. And some of these supply chain vectors would, you are largely protecting the country at large, because the same supply chain, even if you have detected it, through them you are passing that information back to all. So it's not that you spend all your time on this and don't bother about your own environment, but on one parallel track it's important that you inform, have this knowledge sharing thing in place. The second and the most important, which is more on technical side, is moment you have come to know what potentially has happened, see if you assess the kind of issues that are in your environment. Do you have similar components running? Do you have these versions? Do you have a match of all your own inventory reflecting on those components which have been exploited? If that is case, please isolate it first before you really think of, but isolation only if you think potentially there is something going wrong. Otherwise, quickly patch, fix it, and see traffic, whether there is any traffic anomalies that you are seeing in your environment. If there is any, gauge the extent of compromise, figure out how deep that is, what potentially has gone wrong. Is it showing some signs? Are there any C2C connections that are evident? Are there any, because by then you would have also got some information of either indicators of compromise or the modus operandi or the TTPs. So you should use that TTP in your own environment to immediately check the compromise assessment. So seeing whether there is anything going wrong and to what extent it has spread out, or it is has the potential of spreading out. If you have vulnerable components, can you quickly fix it? Can you disable it if it's not required? Or can you mitigate that risk? Or if you want to live with it, it's IT operations, take a conscious call and inform your leadership board and all the stakeholders and say, boss, this is, if I stop this, the business is going to lose. But if I don't fix this, probably there is a potential of things going wrong. So how do I put in the set of compensatory control or ring fence it? Once I have that, I would I would also compulsory control would be actually required when you are not able to fix it or you don't know what needs to be done and no fix is available at times. So again, the scenarios would be different if you have been impacted or somebody else has been impacted, and basis which you are taking this learning and you want to be proactively preserving it, or the entity itself is impacted and you want to take action. So each of them will have a different course of action. But in some scenarios, I'm taking the scenario where the entity itself is impacted, wherein you would have to immediately know the extent of compromise. You have to work on to restore your operations. But in case you are learning from a supply chain attack elsewhere, but you want to be proactive in assessing your efficacy or controls or your environment in a way that things don't go wrong, wherein the fix itself is not available, but you have got indicators of compromise. Bring it in your environment, check out the efficacy of those controls, see whether the indicators are indicating anything that potentially has happened in your environment. If that is none, then probably you can rest assured and say, for now it's fine, but I will upgrade or bring it up. These vulnerable components will be sunset, or you have to do various actions. But if you have been compromised, the first other things matter, but more important would be to restore operations. So you will have to work out with the supplier, get the clean image, get the operations done, ensure that all the images that you're putting it now for operations are still not malware infected or is not impacted with the same attack. BCP for such things. I mean, you have to be also proactive in these. How often are you doing your own due diligence? How often are you doing these drills to figure out if there is a supply chain attack? How can I come back? Is it documented? Because if these things are documented, it's immediately and obvious that you can fall back on that, and you have replayed it. You know this will work. If it is ad hoc, you primarily would end up in messing up more than you will be able to improve. The next part, which you are asking about, the boardroom or compliance issue, no, I don't think so. It's a compliance checklist item, but it is definitely a board issue because the board is definitely concerned on the key risks that organization faces. And we have all now have a concurrence that cyber is one of the important risks that the board is concerned about. So within cyber, if I have to take top 5 risks within cyber that every organization which I have been part of or elsewhere, entire BFSI sector, at least at large, would be concerned. One of them is a supply chain risk, and it's becoming more and more potent, potentially strong vector. And because that's the area which typically the industry has been trusting, and that is what the path is actually coming into your environment, into the environments and compromising you. So it's definitely a boardroom matter. It's definitely a strategic planning point. You need to work out with your OEMs, you need to work out with your partners, you need to work out with the leadership. It's not a CISO or a business one team's responsibility. You have to collectively address this, keep the board informed, because there are tolerance levels. You will have to bring it up in a way what can be accepted, because certain times there is a preference to a particular vendor, but the vendor has certain issues. So how do you balance it out? It definitely needs a risk appetite or a risk tolerance game, which board can be a good guide for, and ensuring that the priorities are set right, and if possible you can avoid it. If not, at least you are prepared enough to be resilient, that if things go wrong, I will be back on my feet in the minimal impact. So for sure, it's a board matter.
How should BFSI companies assess a vendor security posture to avoid the risk of supply chain attacks? And how do you handle it at NSE?
This is my experience over the years. I have seen it's very easy to get the best from the vendors when it comes to supply chain or any other risk. Any vendor, whenever you have to get a risk mitigations in place, shift left is the mantra for me. Do as much as you can before onboarding a vendor. If you have your requirements very explicitly documented, if you have a compliance mandates clearly laid out, if you have the policies laid out, you have the expectation setting done, it will actually help you get the initial product right what you wanted it to be. That if that is not there, it sometimes becomes a post facto correction, and that sometimes feels that it's a cost burden to either the supplier or the entity, or the compliance costs or the efforts are sometimes seen as too much, which were not as part of initial contracting. So in my opinion, if to assess a security posture and to see whether we are finding minimal issues, we should actually shift left and get it part of acquisition or get it part of the procurement cycle. So the checks would still be the same, but the impact that those checks will make is much more significant. So either side, I think the most important ones are put your requirements up there, and see what the responses that comes in from them, and your expectations, whether functional requirements are typically always there as part of these assessments that we do for a vendor. But if you have to do a security posture assessment, put your security assessments, sorry, if you want to do a security posture assessment of these vendors, put your security requirements as well. Get him answer those, get him address those issues. uh, Let him give a self attestation, let him give a certification, let him give a standard adherence, whatever he can, in the best interest of his own organization, and to the contract he should be able to make that visible. But checklists are, and checklists should be very granular, it should be domain specific, it should be specific to the scope of work that you're engaging. No one size fit all in the entire chain. But checklists are again point in time issues, so you will never be able to know what currently is happening. So I recommend that one also looks at external attack surface monitoring for these some of your critical vendors. You have a look at what is outside in view for them. If similar to what one does for its own organization, you should actually be also looking at what happens if this is exposed outside. How is what sort of exposure, what sort of vulnerability. So a continuous attack surface monitoring of that, a continuous visibility of if there has been compromise of the data or of those partners or those vendors anywhere else. So that's something which gives us a reasonable visibility of if that data which has got compromised from that entity is one, a reflection of the data of the organization. Second, if there is a frequent breach or frequent data compromise, it gives us some free visibility on the set of control efficacy that's existing in that environment, which may be for any other organization. But if a client is continuously getting breached or is targeted, you know that there is some level of more due diligence. Or the other is, you wherever it's feasible, and that becomes less feasible in cloud environments, wherever feasible, do a on-site assessment, not just having a tabletop or just a online assessments, or just give a checklist and let it fill. Just do an on-site assessment, figure out what is it, how the workflow is, what the data protection controls are, what the network visibility is, how the endpoint controls are. When you are having an interaction with the vendors, security teams, and the IT teams, it will get you much more visibility on the cyber hygiene that exists there, the kind of seriousness that they have. Because otherwise, on paper, everything may look good, but when you're seeing things on ground, when you visit there, while you may try to show a good picture, but it's important that you have a mechanism which actually reflects on. And if possible, if your engagements and the contracting allows, it should also be possible to do a random stuff with a very short notice, not that a planned activity I'd give him 1 month notice, he is better prepared. So do some of those checks, figure out what's are, and it's very important that you have a trust established with the leadership there. You understand what sort of expectation do they carry back in their environment. They all understand what sort of policy mandates or compliance mandates that you have, but it should be very explicitly documented. I still believe contracts are the most important thing in that. So in at NSC and across the sector, we define the third party risk into various around 5 6 categories, if I can think of. The first, and not the most, and it's not in any order, but the risk I see in third party risk, that the operational risk are the biggest concern. In security for sure, definitely, and none of them is an isolated risk category. These are all interrelated. So operational risk, wherein some activity happening, third party disruption, or any DDoS or any other attack or a strike at the partners end would impact your. So operational risks are there, which are one of the categories. Operational risk related to third party. The second is financial risks. You may have penalties coming in from regulator. There are compliance related risks. There are reputational risks, which is the biggest concern for the entire sector because of the trust thing that we carry of the citizens. And so the reputational impact is significant. So the reputational risk is important. Strategic risk, and above all, I still feel I may be biased there, the security risk, because the vulnerability, the exposure, and this is where the target is more and more happening. The other ones have been traditional attack risk categories, which have been existing with all the suppliers. But in case of software, in case of IT, I see more and more security specific risk coming in through vulnerabilities, coming in through the infected products or compromising of your code repositories, ending up compromising your environment or enterprise organization environments. So that's something which is important for us to categorize, and basis which we have a laid down process. We have a governance committee We have what criteria defined, what can be outsourced, what cannot be outsourced, how the data will be managed, what controls, what will be the risk appetite, what tolerance level we will have. So everything is documented, and basis which we and it's not one time. We also have a continuous look and tab on those partners and vendors to ensure that they are up to date with all the control requirements that typically exist. If they are missing out consistently, or they are, because we cannot afford to have a regulatory non-compliance because the vendor is not able to meet it. So better we change a vendor. Again, there are subjectivity there. It's not very easy because sometimes these vendors are monopolistic, but it's important that at least we have a reasonable set of things documented, and we look out for alternates if in case such comes up. But we'll have to keep the vendors and these partners on their toes, and to ensure that all the information and the data that we are leaving with them or giving out for processing is protected at all times.
So, are current SLAs and contracts with third party providers actually enforceable when it comes to cyber accountability, or are they just paper shields?
It is important. I mean, while even if we call it paper shield or we call it on accountability, it is important that you document, because what you have not documented, you will not measure. If you
Correct.
don't measure and you can't chase the vendor, you may end up being on the negative side. So and that's something which is not expected from any of the BFSI entities. So while the enforceability sometimes is under question, but at least it should be documented explicitly, clearly. Accountability should be explicitly documented and put out what is each entity's responsibility. A RACI should be there, because these contentions when they come in. So because SLA, when you breach an SLA, it's typically a monetary penalty that you can enforce. But in the BFSI sector, a monetary penalty is only a subset of the impact that such things can bring into the environment. So a SLA breach in a BFSI sector on account of a third party failing to do its work is will never be able to meet the impact, maybe reputational, maybe the regulatory fines, or in whatever forms we see it, or even from the operational impact perspective, will never be able to actually meet the SLA, the penalties that typically exist. So, but that said, you still need to have it practical SLAs. You need to enforce it. You need to also keep them on their toes in a way that if they are continuously failing to meet SLAs, penalties are aside, you should have a termination clause for them. You cannot continue with such engagement. So it's important. It is enforceable in under law if it is contracted well, but the impact, the penalty, the loss to the service provider will be only minuscule compared to the impact it causes to the organization. So you will have to also keep very important and tight vigil on the kind of deliverables that is coming in. At no point of time you are violating any of the regulations or government mandates. So if there is any clause of any of that kind, irrespective whether there is an SLA or not, you will have to look out for alternates. uh, there is another thing which I think is important, which the industry should start thinking of, is information sharing about these vendors. I mean, you don't need to share the practically costs of how much is the engagement cost that you have, but it's important that the risk related to some of these vendors, at least in the trusted community, starts coming out. Because many a times, and I can quote few from my experience, the vendors, when you give them any observation or any issue as part of their assessment, they typically will come back with an excuse and say, only your organization is asking. I am providing services to a dozen other organizations, none of them is asking it. But the risk is actually real. So when the same thing, they will be doing the same for the other client, and third client and fourth client. So it's important that the consortium comes in together, wherein information sharing about vendors, or if there are certain exposures or certain things or certain negative stuff that's coming up for the vendor, they're proactively known, so that we can look out for alternate. Again, that said, the most important thing which I feel in third party providers and for some of the services is it's very difficult, because sometimes they look very monopolistic, because there are some of the services will be very unique from some such of vendors, and they are so much deep rooted in you. There are so much of dependencies have already been embedded in your system. You sometimes find it very difficult to just replace them. So it's important that you have these documented. It's important that you track it, but keep a tight vigil. Look out for alternates. Not that every now and then you should look for alternate, but where you have a, because it's important to have a trustworthy vendor. But if the vendor is continuously failing and your SLAs are breaching, or it's even if it's enforceable, but if the impact that non compliance is bringing to you is much more than that, irrespective what state you are, it's better to look out for an alternate partner and become in the good books of both your clients, your service, both your clients and the regulator.
Right. So, how do you handle a situation where a critical vendor refuses to share the security audit data or refuses to comply with NSC's cybersecurity expectations? What is the threshold beyond which you will not engage with a vendor?
You need to, one, contract it right and ensure if the critical vendor is refusing to provide you data, it's not in say you will have to at least ensure that you have visibility. And where it's a critical vendor providing you critical services and he doesn't give you assurance of how he's protecting the data, I think it's a no-no. I don't think so. It is something you will be able to accept it and say, boss, I am blind to what he does, but he's my critical vendor. He processes my data well. So that level of things, at least in the regulated sector, you will not be able to accept it. You will not be able to have such vendor on board and work with any regulated entity. But you can always figure out what is it that can give you that comfort. If in certain cases it can give you some comfort, then what is it that can give you comfort? Even if he's not able to explicitly share you granular data, can he give me summary of what sort of things I'm asking? Can he give me a third party assessment reports of what potentially is his posture, rather than giving me entire stuff? He gives me a third party assurance, which actually is something which can give me a reasonable sense of the kind of controls that would be existing there. So look out for some of that. Again, it depends on, when you say critical vendor, it can still mean various things. What sort of data are you sharing? It can mean various things. If it is, this vendor is providing you software, or is it providing you maybe services, or is it a data processing vendor? Depending on the categorization, your actions would be different. But according to me, some of the checks that I still will perform is, I'll ask him is that, okay, let me ask him, give me your due diligence or give me your self attestation of what is it that you do for something like this. Say for example, a data protection or data encryption. What is it that you do? How do you encrypt it? What are your access control mechanisms? If he is able to provide me that without even sharing me audit data, audit maybe findings that which he is maybe apprehensive of, but other than that, that should give me a reasonable assurance. Depending on what risk is lying with that vendor also is important. But because a software vendor and a data processing vendor both will have a different kind of risk, so your controls assessments would also be different. The other area which also is important in such cases is, do we have alternates? Do we have multiple vendors who provide similar services? If there are, it becomes easier for the organization to take a call and say, sorry, if you are not budging, I have an alternate guy. The other thing, which again I was as I was referring in my previous discussion, that if you have these expectation setting as part of a pre-onboarding, if you put it as part of your compliance submission, or their proposal, their technical proposals should mandatorily have these things, there is high chance that he will be able to give you all what you are looking for, because he needs you as a client. He needs your I mean, he want to give you that assurance, boss, I will protect your, tell me what I need. So pre onboarding, at the contracting, before the contracting stage, get everything embedded. There is no question of not. Moment he becomes a partner, there is a possibility that he may say, oh, I'll not give you that. So if you are big enough, if you can, if you need that information and it's happening at the right stage, you will be able to get it. The other thing is the stakes for that guy, and stakes that entity has. I mean, say for example, people typically call out Amazon, or let's say Google or Microsoft for that matter. Say the cloud security, which is typically a concern, but for these entities, the trust that they are giving out to the sector at large, or not only sector, across organization, across the nation, across the globe, is an incident at their end can take their business model off. What is it the stake of that entity for security protection? That should give some assurance. I don't say that you fully take assurance if it's a large organization meant to be secure. No. What I'm saying is the stakes that entity has for keeping the customer's information secure, then the posture, automatically they would also be struggling and striving to give you the best and more secure postures. So indirectly we can get certifications and assurance, but it gives you some level of assurance that this guy's business model is impacted, so he will put all the priorities, your self-assessment checklist, if he has a SOC 2 type 2, if he has ISO certification or whatever, so you can add all that. Other thing which in some smaller organizations can still work is, and they can deliberate within their own management and boards, is take a board undertaking of the partner saying, boss, I do these things and I have get it vetted. So put somebody else's responsibility of that, and it's not the management team, it's the board. And say, for example, there is a data localization mandate that used to exist or is still exist in the financial sector, wherein the mandate is that the third party audit that happens, board will give a one pager on that and say, oh, I certify that this third party audit happened and this third party audit is clean and everything is localized. So I don't need to go to each vendor and sub vendor and figure it out. So there is a board undertaking. In some cases, that can give some level of comfort. The reputation of vendor is important. How big, how critical does he take security? What is it that his footprint is? How does he gain trust on the? You can gain trust. You can look out for his attack surface. You can figure out his own mechanism. See, I'm not saying that one or two of them will fit out. It depends on scenarios. I'm giving hints on what together can help an organization decide whether to take a step forward with that or to step back and say, sorry, this is no go. I mean, that call organization will have to take depending on what is at stake. But I'm just giving hints on how you can get a reasonable assurance on the kind of controls that a vendor would be having at his end, maybe through attack surface, maybe through metrics that are available, maybe through the compromised data, maybe threat intel feeds. A lot of things can give you a feel of whether that guy is as serious as you are, and then you can take a call and probably negotiate on some level of visibility of data or visibility of the controls that are there in that environment. So that's how I think you should be able to handle it.
In the light of recent supply chain attacks like MoveIt, SolarWinds, Log4j, and the recent high profile breaches at DBS Bank and the Bank of China Singapore division, what are the best practices that you would recommend for external dependencies and software supply chain components?
I think those incidents were eye opener for the industry. To be honest, I mean, SolarWinds, even before SolarWinds, I remember in the banking sector in India, we had certain supply chain attacks. So I'll not name the banks. I'll not name but the people who have been working in the banking sector know which what I'm referring. But those things were there, but it was never IT driven. These were more IT driven. MoveIt was a file transfer utility. SolarWinds was again a software agent deployed across the enterprise for various monitoring and all activities. Log4j was another component which was hidden as part of the open source libraries which were brought in. Apache 4Js were there for various services that was existing. So these were more IT centric stuff, different than the typical earlier supply chain attacks. Yes, it redefined the way the IT softwares are looked at from being brought into the environment. Yes, there are regulations that have been brought in. There have been SBOM that certain has mandated of late. While the software composition analysis was always existing, but it got redefined to the granularity of the SBOM was got more and more granular with the much more detailed visibility on where is it sourced, who is the provider, where is it localized, which geography it is sourced at, what are the authenticated sources, what's the version it is lying, what sort of vulnerabilities that is exposed to, what's the support cycle for that. So a lot of visibility started coming in because when Log4j happened, SolarWind was again, I should say from a scale perspective, yes, it was a significantly big compromise, but the entities which were using SolarWinds were still overall on a global footprint were much smaller. Log4j was almost found in almost all the organizations across the globe. I mean, and nobody knew what to extent that Log4j was being used in the environment. So it was a surprise for most of the organizations, and they started figuring it out while there were some level of control, some level of compensatory control, which immediately came out basis which people put it on their WAFs and put in some compensatory control on their local servers or disabled where it is not required or upgraded it. But visibility was not there, and to be honest, even today you will find some organizations still have a vulnerable Log4j because they are still learning. Those dependencies were not very evident, and that is something which redefined the way the software supply chain security protection worked across. The larger organizations like Microsoft and all have set up forums to actually make it much more secure. Open source libraries, open source, which is one of the more common ways of bringing up the source or creating the source code, That's something which also started showing out more due diligence on what is being brought into the environment. While yes, we all want to absorb or have open source components in the environment, but how sure are we that none of these open source components are actually going to introduce risks which may tomorrow be discovered later? Or if those open source component has certain sub components, now it's a chain of sub components. So somebody created one component that got ingested in another software, that got ingested in a third. So it's an n tier supply chain. It's no longer a one just one level supply chain. So you have subcontracting equivalent, there is subcomponent, and within the subcomponent something has gone wrong. So it's important that there are a lot of regulations which came in. There are a lot of open source risks that are coming in. A lot of forums today exist. So it's all that evolved over a period of time. I think that from organization's perspective, this risk is actually booming. This risk is actually growing. We need to be more diligent around it. Software supply chain risk is a significant risk. We can refer to the NIST standards. NIST 161 gives us the visibility on the security risk, uh, supply chain management, supply chain risk management framework. And I think a few of the things which comes to my mind in protecting this entire stuff is have an inventory of your components. I mean, most important is what you don't see, what you don't know, how will you protect it? So have your requirements, have your inventory of the components that you are using. Try as much that you are at the updated version of inventory. Doesn't mean I need to know only what I am using. I should also know which version I am using. How far is it from the latest version? Are all the bugs and the vulnerabilities already remediated, or are they public? Because these exploits become very easily available because of these open source nature of some of those components. So what versions am I, and can I update those? What vulnerabilities can I have? Compensatory controls of those. Do I have support for those components? If there is anything going wrong, how quickly will I be able to get a timely remediation for that? Are there standards which are existing which adhere to a mechanism where I can trust this particular open source? Have I got a granular SBOM? Have I contracted? Is there any license violations? So some of them are basic hygiene stuff, but it became more pronounced with the incident and the attack that happened. Again, from the best practices, in addition to what I just mentioned, I probably would like to also summarize some of the elements which we earlier mentioned. Also, was that as we receive the functional requirements, we should also have security requirements for software. It may be for SDLC, it may be for off-the-shelf product, it may be for open source, but we should have security requirements explicitly documented, and that's something which will help us. If those are adhered, that will give us a reasonable assurance. SBOM, while it's a mandate now that you should have an SBOM for all the software that are being used in the environment, and the vendor, when you buy an off-the-shelf product, the vendor should give you SBOM. Okay, it's important also from a security perspective to verify that SBOM. So you may get an SBOM, but is that SBOM is in line with what component do you see on ground? So it's important that you verify. You should have tools to run those SBOMs. Verification doesn't mean you become liable or you become responsible for that SBOM. It's important that the responsibility of that SBOM is with the provider. It's contracted, that was the organization, the COTS provider will give me an SBOM, but I should have a mechanism to check the runtime components or the component which are existing, so that if there is anything missed out, the impact is on the client, so on the enterprise. So you will have to get visibility of that is holistic, and you integrate that with your vulnerability scanners. So you should actually integrate in a way that anything going wrong in any component that is outside the secure status, or if there are exposures that are coming in, the vulnerability assessment tools are able to show me that proactively, rather than a symptom cropping up as part of an incident or a breach. In a software supply chain, again, insist on, wherever possible, deeper contracting. Ensure that you get this clean code, you get an updated code, you get the versions updated all the time. You also need to ensure that there is an attestation. There should be some body that give attestation on uh, the efficacy of that code. And there are bodies today which exist wherein they can give support as well as assurance that all the open source libraries that you guys are picking up is reasonably protected and reasonably up to date. So that actually helps. Another area which I feel is important from a software supply chain, which not only important, I think it's important, it's most important and vital, is that there should be a mechanism to verify the integrity of software components, because whatever you have put in there, whatever we are sourcing from the, even from the right sources, there should be a mechanism to validate that this component is in line with what it was supposed to be. So there should be maybe a hashing, maybe a signing. It should be just a reflection of that this can be trusted. If it's signed by a trusted OEM, I normally would have a window of saying, oh, this is not compromised, this is not tampered. So that avoids somebody tampering and bringing in a backdoor or a malware into an environment. Software supply chain also would, it's may not be a direct control, but an indirect control. I would definitely prefer it, that the logs are maintained for whatever is happening in that space. There are test environments which exist, because the software supply chain becomes evident if you do run your application in a staging environment or a test environment. There is a possibility that if there is something not happening right, it's shown up. So have a test environment. Ensure that the test credentials are different than your production credentials. Don't just replicate it there, but it's important that you have these test environments wherein you can, if you, for example, if there's a CrowdStrike equivalent event, had that been put in the test bed, maybe we would have accepted it. Maybe we would have come to know that blue dumps, those things which happened. So maybe some of that will come in, but not that everything would be there. But it's a good practice to have environments, validate in those environments before you are deploying in production. So some of those issues which are runtime can easily be detected. Uh, have a list of authenticated sources for these open source, because some of these components are available. You just put it on Google and you will find it. So it's important that you have the authenticated sources from where you can pick up this code, because so that you have to rely on what is that you can trust it. And so authenticated source, if it is signed, if it has hashed hashing and all, it gives you a reasonable assurance that they are coming from the right one. Keep monitoring the software versions. Ensure that the latest version is which is practical, and you may agree on n-1, that's fine. But till the time it doesn't have any key security vulnerability or exposure, that's fine. Again, reiterating another check, monitor the attack surface. If you know the vendors, if you know, have a threat intel feed specific to some of these components. So you may get a 0 day, you may get another exploit, but your threat intel partner should be robust enough to give you the efficacy of, if there are some of those components, you can bounce off with him and bring it in. Review your code repository, see whether your credentials are correctly mapped, you are not compromising your keys, your secrets are not lying there just unattended. So have some of that, because that becomes an entry point or for a further set of attacks. Wherever possible, go for zero trust. Again, zero trust is a journey. I don't recommend it to be as a tool. You will have to take journey you step by step, but you have to ensure that we don't trust even the service providers. So how do we do that? And couple of controls which I think one technical control is have a browser isolation in a wherever possible, so that even if there are components which are there, it will protect within that browser space. The last one which I want to really focus on, and that becomes more pronounced in a supply chain environment, because the everybody in an organization starts feeling, oh, I just call up a vendor, I engage a vendor and start processing, because many of these services are SaaS services, many of these are easily available. So shadow IT, manage shadow IT, because if shadow IT is out of your control, you will have a lot of surprises cropping up all the time. So there are structured control sets, control recommendations, control directives or policies that you make, but shadow IT doesn't know all of that. They are not aware of what a proper process has to be followed for onboarding, for due diligence. So shadow ID has to be controlled. Then you, and with all this in place, I think you should be able to bring up a reasonable software supply chain uh, grid, and which should give you a lot of assurance as a financial institution to serve your clients with some level of trust.
Sir, it has been very informative and insightful talking to you today, as it always is. Thank you so much for your time today. I know you have quite a packed schedule at NSE, and I'm so glad you took out the time to be our guest for this episode of ETCIO Leaders Speak. So thank you once again. I appreciate your time and effort.
Thank you so much, Neha. It was wonderful connecting with you. Great questions, great thought-provoking questions, I should say. So I enjoyed it as much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
Thank
sir.
you, everyone. Thank you.
Well, we tried to cover a lot of ground during our conversation with Rajesh sir today. I'm sure our viewers got a lot out of this conversation. Thank you for watching.